This is the sixth and final lesson on the Ten Commandments. And the title this evening is Atonement, which really means at one-ment with God, and 7 steps to fulfillment. Joshua Loth Liebman, who was a Jew, said, "Since we human beings are so limited and our language is always inexact," and you understand how that is, the difficulty that we have in communicating with each other about the simplest things. We know that we can never describe God adequately, but must always use metaphor and analogy or parable in order to interpret divine reality. And that is a fact. Words are really symbols. Words are symbols that are assigned to thoughts or concepts. And until we use words, until we have words, we can never really understand life and the things of life. And, of course, it is with words that we share our own understanding. But we have to go beyond the words that we use if we wish to advance our understanding, because your belief system now is confined within your vocabulary of words. There's some things that we must come to understand that are beyond the words that we understand. As a matter of fact, even beyond the words of our human language. Language is the experience of the race to this point. But there are things that are above our human experience that we are seeking to attain to. And that's why that the Bible constantly used metaphor. Jesus did not speak unless he spoke in parable, we're told. Because he was always speaking of something that is beyond the purely human consciousness and the experience that we've had to this moment. And what was true of Jesus was also true of Moses, because Moses, too, was a person who had been transformed into a higher dimension of consciousness and of life. Moses was living from a more exalted state of consciousness than are we ordinary mortals, and he was conveying the inspiration, the insights that come from that level of understanding to the people in the world around him and even on to us. So let's go back and remember that Moses, after he made his escape from Egypt, did go into the wilderness. We know historically that he did meet those 7 daughters, and he married one of them. That is historical, but on the spiritual or the metaphorical side, you remember also that they were the daughters of a priest. Now, the priest in the Bible stands for one's approach to God. Let me explain that for a moment. Just looking back, knowing that Moses was a priest and that there were other priests, the priest is supposed to be the person, supposed to be, quote unquote, who is closer to God. Right? Everybody knows that. Well, what we don't know is that, and have never come to understand, that in time, all of us are to become priests. Meaning, it is our destiny to achieve a level of spiritual consciousness that represents our approach to God or our conscious contact with God. You're to be a priest or a priestess, whichever the case might be. Now, that doesn't mean that you'll get ordained and have a little sign on the door and have one of those little signs on the back of your car with a little cross on it. Doesn't mean that at all. Have you noticed that you do not call me Reverend Boland? Have you noticed that? If you do, I know that you're here for the first time. You're wearing one of those red ribbons. Why? Because we're all the same. There's no difference in us. We're all growing along spiritual lines, seeking to elevate our consciousness so that we will be closer to God. Does this mean that God is off somewhere? No. So that we'll become more aware of God in all things. Well, of course, the 7 daughters represent the 7 main spiritual aspects of God that are potentially expressed in every one of us. These are the 7 avenues through which humanity can approach God in the easiest manner. And I've often thought that Moses married the daughter who represented the aspect of love, because Moses really did not demonstrate very much love in the early part of his life. He demonstrated a great deal of wisdom, meaning intellectual understanding. But Moses was filled with anger and resentment. And as you can recall, he even, in his anger, killed an Egyptian and, of course, had to make his escape. But he was marrying one of those 7 daughters means that he was more involved in the development of that aspect of his life, but it also means that he was close to all the other aspects of God expressing in him. And for each one of us, there's one aspect that is the one that we need to go with, that we can express more easily, just as Moses did. Always in the Bible and in Oriental literature, you will find that marriage is used as being symbolic of the union of God and man. The Old Testament says, your maker is your husband. And all through the Bible, the soul is spoken of as the bride and the Christ power as the bridegroom. Jesus used that analogy on more than one occasion. Moses, as a spiritual leader, was concerned because the people that he was assigned to teach and to lead spent their time struggling with outer things and leaving their consciousness unchanged. They were caught up with problems, with circumstances that were very real to them in their captivity. They were so powerless in face of the conditions that confronted them. In the very same way that you have experienced your own personal powerlessness in your life. And Moses knew that as long as people were involved with or caught up with or reacting to outer circumstances, if they did it for thousands of years, that the world would still be full of strife, wars, labor, troubles, booms followed by depressions, all the things that have been happening to the human race throughout the centuries. We never change anything on the outside, either as an individual or as a collective group of people. So he set to work and drew up his teaching in a manner which he thought best calculated to help everybody. First of all, he wanted to help the people who did not think for themselves and who accepted everything at its face value, but who needed some rough and ready rules to go by. So he put his rules in the form of commandments. You shall do this, in order that they would be understood and responded to by people at that level. But he also knew that there was a stage beyond this, and that when people reached that stage, they needed something more. The people who could think and who could begin to appreciate and assimilate and whose consciousness would be changed by understanding the truth. Now, you know that Moses was one of the greatest prophets who ever existed, and he was a prophet because he practiced spiritual principles in his life. And he was inspired through prayer and meditation, through practicing the presence of God. He was transfigured in the very same sense that Jesus was. And in time, there was a time in Jesus' life when Moses and Elias appeared at Jesus' own transfiguration. And Moses would not have been there unless he represented, in his own experience, exactly what Jesus was demonstrating in his. In the Bible, these instructions, this information, is given in very brief, very concise phrases, whereas our modern psychology is extremely nebulous and windy and wordy. Like here's a book right here, right now. And it has numerous chapters, and it takes lots of words and pages to get our attention. But in the Ten Commandments, you discover that each of those commandments goes right to the heart of something, and that you're dealing not only with the psychological level of life, but you're also, when you get behind the meaning of what's being told there, you are dealing at a much higher or deeper level. The truth is concealed. It's a secret. It's an open secret right there before us. And it is there for those persons who are ready to receive higher things. In other words, Moses designed these laws of life so that the higher we go spiritually, or the deeper we go intellectually, the more we can get out of them. In those days, they used many symbols that we would not use today. As a matter of fact, some of those symbols would be considered today definitely in bad taste. And one of the commonest and most used Hebrew symbols was adultery, for idolatry. In the Old Testament, these two words, adultery and idolatry, were symbolically almost always interchangeable. And the worshiping of false gods was described as adultery. The soul was conceived of as a woman, and God is the husband, and when a man or a woman worshipped a false god, it was described as adultery. Now, to a modern sense, this would be thought of as being in very bad taste, but you have to get back to the meaning that was being conveyed in the words, in the symbology of that time, if we're going to fully grasp and mine from these great words of truth the meaning that's there for us today. We have to interpret it now as it was written then. The fundamental idea behind this commandment is that to have one God means that we become aware that God is the living experience, the living expression of life that is in everyone and in everything. And to come to know that all of our experiences can, if we become aware of the presence of God, connect us with that presence. As you read through the Old Testament, the Psalms, the Proverbs, and particularly the Song of Solomon, or any of the major prophets, you will find the idea of this adulterous woman who is unfaithful to her husband, and this means the human soul, which is turning away from God. In those days, it meant running after one of the heathen Egyptian gods or other gods. Today, it does not mean that at all. It means giving power to outside things. It means, for example, giving power to fear. You shall not commit the adultery that occurs when you let fear control your life. I hope you understand that. If you want to be separated from God instantly, become afraid. Let your fear take over. And following fear, you will let anger take over, because these two powerful negative emotions are almost always connected with each other. Now back to the commandments. This seventh commandment, which I have saved for the last, means exactly what it says. And I saved it for the last because it's one of those commandments that is not readily understood. Certainly the concept of normal married life for married people is valid in every society. At every time, it really is. As a matter of fact, the first thing that Jesus did in public life was to attend the wedding to give his approval to married life. So this commandment that says you shall not commit adultery means exactly that. But it means more than that. And also remember that that when persons were being punished for having committed adultery, they were almost without exception women. Have you ever read a story in the Bible or anywhere else back in those days when a man got stoned for committing adultery? Now, it was always the woman who was being stoned, and it was the men usually who were doing it. It's important to every one of us, I think, that we should ponder this matter, because over a period of several hundred years, the church has created a doctrine of original sin and a theology surrounding that doctrine which is entirely erroneous. And it is a guilt-producing doctrine. The concept that we were born in sin, that small children are born in sin. This doctrine not only fails to explain our basic human nature, but it also fails to give any insight in how to handle these God-given impulses and to properly channel and use these higher forces that are expressing through our humanness. Religion has taught us to believe that our basic nature is ugly, sinful, and wrong, rather than teaching us that it is the wrong use of that nature that is destructive and adulterous. It's not having that nature. The consciousness of the human race has been programmed with so much guilt and fear and shame and remorse that only a few people ever struggle through to the understanding of who they are and of what they are, or of how to handle the forces that are spiritual within each one of us. And it certainly is a struggle to work your way out of the programmed effects of generations of negative reactions to misinformation into a meaningful, happy, joyful, physical, and psychologically sane relationship with a member of the opposite sex. And there I said that word, sex. It's a word that is automatically implies the sinful side of our nature. In our language, the language of earthly people, when you think of adultery, you think of marriage and sex outside of marriage. Well, at this level of the law, thou shalt not commit adultery, that is true. That really is the way that it is. But remember that Moses was leading the children of Israel out of Egypt, where everything was acceptable. And he was taking them into the promised land, into the promised good, establishing a new nation, which meant he was establishing a new consciousness that was to be built on the sanctity of the family unit. And that family unit was to be their strength, which it was, and which it still is. So that reality and the power that comes from establishing that level of consciousness exists to this very day. Now, the word adultery comes from a root word that means to abase, to pollute, to defile, or to make impure by the addition of a baser substance. Let's return a moment to one of the lessons that I did some time ago called the superpowers of the mind, and perhaps you will remember the 12th power, the youngest power, meaning the one that was the least disciplined. And if you recall, that was the power of life, of the life force. And it was analogous to our human sexuality. And recall the disciple that was assigned to that power? Judas. Remember that Judas betrayed the Christ? That's exactly what happens in our own lives. It is our sexuality, the misuse of our sexuality, betrays our higher nature. But do you know that all of the other 11 disciples betrayed the Christ too? Judas was the one that was selected to set the example for all of the rest of the powers, but for the right use of them. You see, a disciple is a person who is practicing spiritual principles to learn how to take charge of all of the forces or the powers that exist within us, how to correctly, spiritually apply, use. And when Judas left the 12, as a matter of fact, one of the stories is that he committed suicide, that power was not just expunged, it was not declared to be a bad power, never was. Another disciple was selected, whose name was Matthias, and if you'll check it out, you'll see that the word Matthias means wholly dedicated to God, that another disciple came in to take charge, to discipline. It was what the power did, how it acted, that caused the adultery, or the abasement, or the shame, or the problem that began to exist. Now, one of the old ideas that has come down to us is that all marriages are created somehow in heaven, and are therefore holy. And that since a marriage is holy, you dare not do anything about it, even if you think it was created in hell. You're understanding what I'm saying, aren't you? You know that there have been some marriages, not all of them, and certainly not yours. There have been some marriages that have been created in the backseat of somebody's car. Many people have fallen in lust with each other. And in so doing, committed the adultery that came even later on, in that the relationship was such that it diminished, that it abased. that in the conflict between the personalities, there was never any way that those people could establish their conscious contact with God. And so this commandment is saying, do not commit adultery. Do not let anything that exists in your life get between you and God. As a matter of fact, everything that you select, every partnership, every arrangement, everything that exists in your world is there to be used to honor, to glorify God. It should be an arrangement in which and from which you should be able to draw strength. Remember the story of the woman who was taken in adultery, about to be stoned? And Jesus went to her and lifted her up, and he turned to the men who were about to stone her and said, he who among you who has not had the same experience, who is without sin, cast the first stone. And they all left. And then he said to her, woman, where are your accusers? And the only accuser left was she herself. And he forgave her. When I say he forgave her, he didn't even blame her for the experience, but he was saying to her, set yourself free. Forgive yourself. Let go of the consequences of the experience that you have had in this arrangement that has separated you from your conscious contact with God. You shall not commit adultery. Forgive and release. Know that no one, no thing should come before your conscious contact with God. God must be in the beginning of every experience. But suppose that you've had a relationship which did not begin with God. What do? It's very simple, but it's very important that you stop right where you are, forgiving all persons, and start all over in the beginning. See, one of the great truths that we're being taught is that no matter where you are, it is the beginning. If you've left God out of anything, you've committed idolatry or adultery. But you can always bring God back into that situation at any moment of your life when you become aware. And so, when the commandment says you shall not commit adultery, it also means if you have committed adultery or idolatry, or if you have the experience of separation, or if you put anyone or anything else first, then stop right where you are and begin all over again, bringing God into the situation, and watch the remarkable things that will begin to happen in that moment. The astonishing, at the atonement, at the at-one-ment that immediately begins to happen in your life. 7 steps to a prosperous life. Remember the Sabbath to keep it holy. The word holy means associated with a divine power. Or it comes from a root word which means whole or uninjured. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter or your manservant or your maidservant or your cattle or your cat. I threw that one in. Or the visitor who is within your gates. And this is the Oriental way of going to an extreme and saying that when we say you're not supposed to do anything, we really mean that you're not supposed to do anything on the Sabbath. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. Well, the word Sabbath really means the 7th day of the week. And in this commandment, we have reached the end of our study of the commandments, at least to this point. And I kept it to the end because it's perhaps the one which is at least understood. I'm sure that some of you are going to be shocked by some of the things I say, just as you were shocked a few minutes ago by something that I said. And I said what I said purposely, because oftentimes we need a conscious shock to jar us out of our old concepts, out of our old ideas, so that we can see or hear or think or feel beyond where we were. Unless we're shocked, we'll probably never get beyond the interpretations of any subject that we have given by the words, the concepts that we use. Now, this commandment was given to the people at the time of their leaving Egypt and when they were going into the desert. And on the surface, it meant exactly what it said for that age. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. It was a wonderful thing that happened in Moses' day to insist that everybody set aside a day a week to think about God and about religion, or at least to oblige that person to stop his secular or outer activities. And you know that no rule made by Moses or no law made by Parliament or Congress or anyone else can make a person religious or make them spiritual and give them faith. But it can help. It can give us an opportunity to practice some things. And this law was made compulsory for everybody at that time, and it was done so because the Israelites had been for a long, long season in their lives the captives or the slaves of the Egyptians. And you're talking about slavery. They knew slavery. They worked 7 days a week from sunrise to sunset. They could own no property except their purely personal possessions. They were owned by their lords. They were told what to do, when to do it, and how to do it. They had no choices, very few choices of their own. And then in time to be able to get 1 day of rest, and it's quite probable that the reason that they got that day of rest was because they applied to their labor union to use it for spiritual worship. Their owners were not going to give them a day just to rest because they didn't care about them being rested. They did not care if they were worked to death because there would be someone else to come in and take their place. That's the way it was. Now Moses was most interested, emphatically interested, in having the people that were following him, his followers, use that day in a very specific way. Remember that he was taking them out into the wilderness to retrain their spiritual nature. And he knew that if they just rested, they would think the same thoughts that they thought all week long. They would have the same prejudices, the same anger, the same fear. They'd spend all day talking about their slave owners who worked them for 6 days. You understand how that is, don't you? They'd all get together and have a hate session every on the 7th day, thinking about what they were going to have to do next week. And so he assigned them this day as one of a time of not only of rest, but of listening. And they were to be lectured to, instructed. They would go to little seminars to change their thinking. And if there had been any cassette tapes around, they'd have been listening to them too on that day, because it was a day that was assigned to the changing of their thinking. Now, he arranged that it should be the 7th day, which we call Saturday, or Saturn's Day, and they called it the Sabbath because it was the 7th or the last day of the week. Now, they became so attached to this day. It became a tradition with them. And anytime something becomes a tradition, trouble is about to happen. Because you begin to lose the understanding of the reason why you started it in the first place. It becomes something to do just for the sake of doing it. And so a year can pass, a generation can pass, 100 years can pass, and when 1,000 years has passed and you are following in a tradition, it becomes holy or sacred, or we don't even remember why we're doing it, but we're doing it anyhow, and you had better do it. Or the law says you will lose your life. Because after a time, you begin to have laws that protect traditions. You understand, don't you? Now, Jesus came along, and some hundreds of years later, And his people were so locked into a tradition that they had no reason for it. Do you think that they were worshiping God then? They just had a day off. But they were so rigid that a person could really be severely punished by milking a cow if they had one, or moving, or just walking more than a few yards outside their own home. And so what he was saying to them is that this tradition is religious. Is ridiculous. Do you think that by keeping the Sabbath that you are any more religious than you were yesterday? Or that there's one day of the week that is holier? Or that there's one day of the week that you can experience God? Not at all. And so he, for example, he healed a man on the Sabbath. He met a poor creature who was in agony, had been sick for years and had lost all hope. Just a poor sick nobody, but he had the right heart. Jesus saw it and he healed him. And all of the people who hated Jesus, were jealous of him, said, "Oh, you healed a man on the Sabbath day." And Jesus answered them suitably. But even his immediate followers, his disciples, who had been caught up in the old tradition, found themselves fearful of what he was doing. Now today, you would not imagine that just by abstaining from work on Sunday that you're going to save your soul. You wouldn't think that. An idle Sunday is of no more spiritual value than an idle Thursday or Tuesday. And to think so is to be superstitious. Do you know that for a long time here in my own life, I have, whether it's been necessary or not, I have found it necessary to work about 7 days a week. And every now and then I take a day off. And when I do, it makes me feel so good that I can hardly stand it. I just love it. And it becomes like a Sabbath in that it brings me joy. But I don't care what day of the week it is. All the 7 days are the same in the eyes of God. And so that Sabbath was not a special holy day. Now, would you like to go to a deeper meaning of this very important commandment? Always the 7 days of creation are the time that it takes to create a new condition in your life, a healing, or coming into a state of harmony in some personal relationship. It's also true for the negative things that we make, for the miraculous problems that we sometimes create. Think of your last major problem just for a moment. It took you 7 days to create it. It may have taken 2 years. Or you may have been able to arrange it within 10 or 15 minutes. But it was 7 days. In the analogy of the spiritual law. The difficulties and problems we get into by acting or speaking unwisely always take 7 days. And the miracles that we create take 7 days. Have you ever found yourself talking yourself into a major problem in about 5 minutes? In 7 days. Can you remember the time that you were employed by that company? And when you got the job, it was such a miracle. You called all your friends to let them know this wonderful thing that had happened to you. And then sometime, a few months later, you hated the company. Didn't like your work. Remember when that happened? It took 7 days. It takes 7 days to bring about the changes in us that are reflected in the new state of mind, the new condition that exists there. It's only been a short time ago that I was talking to a woman, and she asked me if I would join her in praying for her son. She said, I keep praying for my son, and nothing ever happens. And she said, I'm sure that if you will pray with me, that a miracle will take place in his life. And I thought, from the way that she was talking about him, that he must be in high school. Must be a teenager in high school. And I said, how old is your son? And she said, he's 37. And she told me a little bit more about her son. And I said, okay, I'll tell you what we'll do. we're going to take 10 seconds to pray for your son. She said, 10 seconds? Can we fix it in 10 seconds? I said, we can fix it in 10 seconds. You haven't fixed it in 37 years, but we can fix it in 10 seconds. Because the 10 seconds represents the time that it takes to be at rest. Have you noticed that when you're working with a problem, and you keep working with the problem, and you're working with the problem and working with the problem, and the problem consumes your mind, your thoughts, your feelings, that's the 6 days. It is not until we reach that state of mind in which we can let go and let God that represents the 7th day. Another example. Have you ever planted a seed in the ground? Maybe when you were a kid, you can recall it. You planted a pumpkin seed, and almost immediately you wanted a pumpkin. Remember? And you planted the seed and went and dug it up within minutes or hours or the next day to see what was happening to the pumpkin seed. Well, the moment that you dug it up, it stopped growing. And that's what happens with our prayers. And this commandment is telling us how to pray effectively. Do your work and then rest. Do everything that you need to do and then quit. Then let go. And you will notice that as you do your spiritual work, working through the fear, the anxiety, the worry, all of the negatives that try to come in to keep us from believing the truth. And then in time, being able to put on those facets of our mind of faith and love and of excitement and of certainty. Something begins to change. And then one day, you're not working anymore. You just know. You're resting. You're caught up with the feeling of the presence of God. God is there, and you know that it's going to be all right. You don't have to pray about it anymore. You who are mastermind partners, have you had a mastermind partner that for weeks and weeks and months comes into your mastermind meeting and keeps praying for the same thing? And you want to say, just rest, just let it go. Give God the chance. Make your peace. Face the consequences. The worst thing that could possibly happen. Then make your peace. And rest. Now, there's more to this principle. Something more. Of all the things that we learn from our study of the Bible and from the inspiration that comes to us when we establish our conscious contact with God, one of the greatest is when we begin to discover that there is no separation from our outer natural world and our spiritual world. You see, in time, we come to understand that every day is the Sabbath. Because remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy, the commandment, meaning keep the day connected with the presence of God in your life. Keep all of the events that are happening to you connected with your awareness of the presence of God. If you work real hard, you may be able to do that one day a week in the beginning. But if you're not doing anything else and concentrating on it, boy, you can almost make it. But suppose you lived your life, the rest of your life, with 6 days of out there in the world, and then one day of establishing a conscious contact with God. That's not what the teaching in the Bible is all about. What it is leading us to is creating the kind of consciousness in time that makes every day the Sabbath day, so that you don't have to take the day of rest, or you don't have to take the time off from your work. In the middle of what you're doing, you're practicing the presence of God. You are remembering the Sabbath and keeping it holy. You're coming to understand that every day of your life is wonderful. This is the day that God has made, and I will rejoice and be glad. Like the Lord God said to Moses, the ground on which you stand is holy. Do you believe that in your life? Do you really believe that right where you are, God is all day long, every day. But every situation, I know you believe it, but do you remember it? Do you practice it? It's the practicing of it. It is the remembering of that consciousness, becoming aware. And in that awareness, your life changes dramatically. Totally changes. No longer is there an inside and an outside. No longer is there a spiritual life and your other life. No longer is there the religious life, the life of the church, and the life of your purely human self. No longer are there difficulties. No longer are there different kinds of experiences. There's only one experience, and that experience is your relationship with God. You see, you could sit in the most beautiful church in the world and have mean thoughts and bring about trouble. Or you could sit in the worst situation that could ever possibly happen to a human being. You could be imprisoned unjustly. You could be accused of something that you did not do and be confined for what would appear to be years. And if you could remember the Sabbath and keep it holy, if you could connect your experience right where you are with the presence of God, it will change. God is present everywhere. That's the meaning of the Sabbath in its deepest sense. And for those who understand this deepest of all teaching, life becomes heaven on earth. That's what Moses was teaching. It took him a while to get there. And in the process, he had to discover things within himself that separated him from God. And he was revealing to us through his own experience and his own insights these great truths. And he put them into a system of ideas that can be understood and practiced in the very simplest form by any person living on this planet. You can take them literally, and they will change your life. You can take them intellectually, and they will change your life even more. You can go even deeper and take them spiritually. You can become them, and your world will change because you will be in the presence of God. Alfred Lord Tennyson wrote, "Our little systems have their day. They have their day and cease to be. They are but broken lights of thee, and thou, O Lord, art more than they." And I know you hear what he's saying, that the spiritual systems that we practice help us. They lead us to God. But never take a system and worship it. And never see a system as the final answer in itself, like Jesus had to come and not to change the law of Moses. He said, "I am the fulfillment of the law." But you have made it a religion. You've come to worship the thing and don't even understand what it's about. In reality, the Spirit of God is not only with you, but it is in you. And the system was designed to bring you to that place where God was a constant factor in your life, with you, experienceable. And in that experience, you are transformed. You're the Moses who goes up into the mountain and doesn't even have to pray. Because for Moses, every experience is a prayer. Every moment is a sacrament. And every event is a demonstration of God's power. And that's the way it really is.